This is not a talk about the pros and cons of remarriage or cohabitation. It is something far more precise and far more urgent. This talk is for those who stand in the later chapters of life, particularly women over 60 who are considering opening their hearts again but hesitate. Not because they don't believe in love, but because they understand loss. You see, love in youth is expansion. It is driven by possibility, by curiosity, by the intoxication of what might be. But love in later life is reconstruction. It is not built on possibility. It is built on what has already been broken. By the time we reach our 60s, we are no longer strangers to absence. We have lost partners. We have lost marriages. Some of us, quietly and over time, have even lost parts of ourselves. So when we speak of remarriage or companionship at this stage, we are not speaking about excitement. We are speaking about fear. More precisely, how do we live with the fear of losing again? And for women, this question carries a different weight, because now there is no longer a reason to endure. Not for children, not for survival, not for social expectation. For the first time, perhaps in an entire lifetime, a relationship becomes distilled into a single, uncompromising question. Am I treated with dignity in this relationship? And from this question, everything else follows. So what then should one be cautious of? Let us examine this not morally, but structurally. First, be cautious of relationships where the language of money appears before the language of emotion. If before intimacy even begins, the conversation is already about who pays what percentage is fair, what rules will govern the arrangement, then you must ask, is this relationship being built on connection or on risk management? Because when financial architecture precedes emotional trust, the relationship is not being opened. It is being insured. Second, be wary of those who use the word rational to invalidate emotion. Statements like, that's just emotional. Let's be fair. What's the problem? At first glance, these sound reasonable, but repeated often enough, they transform the relationship into something else entirely. Not a space of understanding, but a space of interrogation, where every feeling must be justified, where every discomfort must be defended, and slowly, without realizing it, you are no longer relating. You are testifying. Third, be cautious of the idea that emotional and financial separation is a sign of maturity. You may hear phrases like, it's cleaner if we keep things separate. Dependence is dangerous. On the surface, this sounds like independence, but structurally, it may be something else. A quiet declaration, I will not entangle my life with yours. And when entanglement disappears, so does intimacy. Now, let us be clear. What women need at this stage is not persuasion, not strategy, not techniques to change the other person. What is required is far simpler and far more difficult. The courage to trust one's own internal sense. Ask yourself, am I at ease in this relationship? Can I exist without constantly explaining myself? Can I laugh without calculating? If the answer to these questions is not yes, then something in the structure is already tightening. At this point, let us borrow a philosophical insight. An ancient Tibetan text describes the psychology of those approaching death. It suggests that what people cling to most intensely is not life itself, but form, possession, identities, relationships as fixed, controlled structures. The impulse to hold on, to stabilize, to prevent loss, ironically, becomes the very source of suffering. Now consider this. When an older man begins to overstructure a relationship, defining expenses, fixing roles, insisting on fairness as an absolute principle, what lies beneath? Often, it is not control for its own sake. It is fear. The fear of losing again. The fear of instability. The fear of emotional collapse. But here is the paradox. A relationship built to eliminate risk does not become safe. It only becomes rigid. And rigidity is not the same as security. It merely looks like it. So what then is wisdom in this context? It is not being seduced by that rigidity. It is recognizing that relationships are not contracts. They are acts of risk. To enter a relationship is to accept uncertainty. To open oneself is to accept the possibility of loss. And yet, there is still one viable path forward. Only one. A sustainable late-life relationship is not built on tighter structures, but on softer ones, where money is not the first language. Structure remains flexible, and emotional expression is never assigned a cost. In other words, not a relationship that is stable, but one that is safe. For men, the final transformation required is not better calculation, but the courage to admit fear. To say, I am afraid you might leave, and so I tried to create rules to protect myself. But if those rules made you feel constrained, I was wrong. This is not weakness. This is the highest form of strength available in later life. And for women, the final standard is not the partner's promises, but their own internal experience. Return again to the three questions. Am I at ease? Can I exist without explanation? Can I laugh without calculation? If the answer is no, then the issue is not adjustment. It is reconstruction. In the end, late life relationships are not about success or failure. They are about one thing: how we choose to deal with fear. If fear is covered with control, the relationship disappears. If fear is acknowledged with honesty, the relationship, though fragile, can survive. Understanding always arrives later than judgment, but when it arrives, it has the power to change direction. If this perspective resonates with you, consider subscribing and sharing this channel. This is a space for those who seek to understand relationships not as emotion alone, but as structure. And in the next part, we will examine more deeply why some late-life relationships begin not with love, but with the management of fear. And so we arrive at a critical turning point. If earlier we asked whether a relationship is built on connection or on control, we must now go one level deeper. What happens when a relationship is structured to avoid entanglement altogether? Because this is where many late-life relationships do not explode. They simply dissolve, quietly, cleanly, almost politely. Let us examine the structure. Second, there is a pattern I want you to notice. It often appears mature, even wise on the surface, but underneath, it reveals something very different. It is the separation of responsibility. At first glance, this seems healthy. After all, independence is often celebrated in Western culture. We are taught to respect boundaries, to avoid overdependence, to own our lives. But there is a difference between boundaries and disengagement. In these relationships, what appears is not a shared emotional ecosystem, but a kind of alliance between two individuals who remain fundamentally separate. Consider how family issues are handled. If one partner is dealing with an aging parent or a struggling child, the response is often, "That's your responsibility." There may be polite sympathy, even verbal empathy, but rarely true involvement. What we see here is not cruelty. It is distance carefully maintained. This pattern extends further. Even the future is designed separately. Health, aging, medical decisions, insurance, retirement, all are managed individually. You will often hear the same phrase repeated: just in case something goes wrong, just in case the relationship does not last. And in that quiet phrase, the entire architecture of the relationship is revealed. It is not built around a shared future, but around parallel safety systems. And then, perhaps most critically, conflict itself is individualized. When tension arises, the response is not, "Let's work through this together." Instead, it becomes, "Let's each take time to process and talk later." Again, this sounds reasonable, but structurally, something important is happening. The relationship is not learning how to resolve tension as a unit. It is outsourcing resolution back to the individual. And over time, the capacity to face difficulty together atrophies. Now we arrive at the most decisive layer, a belief often expressed like this: emotions are personal. Everyone should manage their own. On the surface, this sounds like emotional maturity. In reality, it often functions as a mechanism of distance. You may hear, "I'm just someone who processes things alone." Feelings are not deeply explored. Questions are minimized. Emotional exposure becomes uncomfortable. And so intimacy never fully forms. Even in moments of vulnerability, the pattern continues. When one partner says, "I'm struggling," the response is not comfort, but instruction. You need to be stronger. You should learn to handle that yourself. Self-regulation is prioritized over connection. Independence replaces empathy. And when conflict repeats, the system activates its final defense: withdrawal. Maybe we should take some space. Let's have time apart. Notice this carefully. Distance is not the last resort. It is the first reflex. Now, when you step back, a pattern becomes undeniable. From the very beginning, this relationship was designed to be left. Money is not shared. Responsibility is not shared. Emotion is not deeply shared. And so when strain increases, there is very little holding it together. There are no explosive arguments, no dramatic endings. Instead, there is a quiet conclusion. We're just tired. But here is the crucial insight. These relationships do not collapse because they are unfair. They do not end because they lack logic. In fact, they end for the opposite reason. They are too rational, too calculated, too easy to exit. When conflict arises, it does not move toward reconciliation. It moves toward accounting. When pain deepens, it does not move toward dialogue. It moves toward distance. And in the end, both people walk away, not with anger, but with exhaustion. But that exhaustion is often misunderstood. It is not simply fatigue with the other person. It is something deeper, something structural. From the very beginning, the relationship never fully became a shared world. It remained two separate systems, briefly aligned. At this point, we can return to a philosophical insight. An ancient teaching suggests it is the desire to hold on that creates suffering. The need to control, the need to avoid loss, the need to protect oneself from pain, ironically becomes the very force that destroys connection. Because when you try to eliminate risk in a relationship, you also eliminate depth. And so what is actually required in later life is not a more sophisticated system, not a better financial arrangement, not a more precise agreement. What is required is courage. The courage to say, "I am afraid of losing again, and so I tried to protect myself. But in doing so, I may have pushed you away." This is the moment where a relationship can transform, where it stops being a contract and begins becoming a community. And for women, the final measure remains unchanged. Not promises, not logic, not structure, but sensation. Return to the three questions. Am I at ease? Can I exist without constant explanation? Can I laugh without calculation? If the answer is no, then the relationship is no longer in need of adjustment. It is in need of redesign, which leads us to the next unavoidable question. If these highly rational, carefully structured relationships are the ones most likely to end, then what kind of structure actually endures? Why is it that relationships that appear less balanced on the surface sometimes last longer? Why does choosing entanglement rather than avoiding it create stability? Why does a relationship that is harder to leave often become the one that survives? In the next part, we will examine this directly. We will explore the fundamental difference between relationships designed as contracts and those designed as communities. And we will ask, why is modern love increasingly spoken in the language of finance? And what does that reveal about our deeper fears? Because in the end, love in later life is not deepened by better control, but by the willingness to endure uncertainty. The question is simple. Will you choose courage? Or will you remain inside a structure that only appears safe? If this reflection gave you something to think about, consider subscribing and share. This channel is for those who seek to understand relationships, not through blame, but through structure. And in part 4, we will go deeper into the hidden strength of relationships designed as true communities.